So I've got four general areas talking about the priorities for the next 10 years. The first is bringing the current generation of, I still say ACTs to the market. I'm sure there are people out there that say it's not really the market, it's the patients. And to make sure that they're expanded in terms of being able to reach the smallest kids, the pregnant women, the suffering. Second, to make sure, as previous speakers have said, that we actually do have a GMP, a quality treatment for severe malaria. And then to look at the next generation of treatments, compounds that work against all the resistant strains. And that sounds really easy, but what we're saying there is that we want compounds which are active against strains which will emerge in the future, because it's going to take us 10 years to get there. So when we get there, we need to know what strains are already out there. And as again has been said, things that stop the gametocytes, the sexual stages, so that we stop infecting the mosquito here that infects our friends and our nearest and dearest. And finally, the radical cure for vivax malaria. That vivax malaria probably kills around a 10th to a 15th of the number of people that die in malaria. But on its own, it's actually a key neglected disease. And most of the research in the last 20 years has not really been in this area. But as we start to see falciparum come down in Africa, then the relative importance of vivax will go up. We have over 50 projects. What's interesting to me is to look at, on the right-hand side, you have the development ones, the things that are coming out in the next couple of years. In the middle, in the translational area, we've said it takes us 7 to 10 years to get things out from preclinical to the marketplace. So these are the things you will see in the next few years. And it's quite a healthy pipeline compared with a few years back. But if you imagine that everything going into preclinical has a 1 in 10 chance of coming out the other end, then we really do need more things in that area. What's nice are the yellow boxes on the other side, but remember they're even further away from the patients, both in time and probability. We talked a little bit about Coartem D and Novartis, but just to say it's our first product. It was approved at the end of last year, and it's been pre-qualified this year. I think the key thing to focus on here is not just the advantages for the children, but to look at the bottom. What do we do next? Next step is just to make sure we've done clinical trials on 3,000 patients, but the question is, what does it actually do out into the community? So that's with the INES network in Tanzania mainly, to look at what happens in communities. Do they actually take it? How well do they take it? How well do they respond? Second is with EDCTP, working on the longitudinal studies, so saying that actually when you have malaria, you don't just get one attack and you're cured and that's it for the rest of your life. That a lot of our patients will be taking the drug over and over again during their lives. What actually happens? That's not something we tend to look at in the registration clinical trial. And finally, with Novartis, what we're putting in place is a study to look at what happens in asymptomatic carriers. So knowing in Africa that lots of people have parasite and not disease, if this was any other disease area, these people will be treated seriously as a health problem. The question is, in the long term, how do the drugs work against them? What is the right treatment regime? What are we going to do? If you look at the next drug, eradication, so eradication is with Sigma Tau. It was originally a collaboration with our friends at Holly and at Oxford. That has an advantage. I always feel like we have 4 kids, so I always get trouble if you praise one child rather than the other. But here then, I have to be able to say some of the advantages and the disadvantages, so I'm dead over a beer later. But the advantage is it's a once-a-day treatment. It also has a longer half-life, and Peter talked about longer half-lives being good or bad, but say at least it protects you better against being reinfected, certainly if you look at day 42. So where we are at the moment is it's been submitted to the European authorities. It actually went in on the 3rd of July, which was, for me as an industrial guy, it went in on the date that we said it would go in, sort of 12 months earlier, so that's a major achievement. Next stage is actually to get the registrations done in the disease endemic countries, get it approved by the Europeans, get it through WHO pre-qualification, so get all the registration commitments sorted out. And then to look at what happens again longitudinally when you keep giving the drug, and to look out in the field what happens in the communities. How well do they accept it? What do they like? What are the responses like? Third one, Pyromax. So this is this is almost like our baby, our Benjamin. So to say this is a collaboration with Xingpoon, which is a Korean, largely a Korean generics company. I think that's one thing to talk about with the pharmaceutical interactions. Then we have everybody from the big boys of Novartis and Pfizer all the way through to different flavors of companies. Here the advantage is, in fact, because it's a Korean company, we're obliged to do clinical studies in Korea, and therefore we did them in Vivax. So we have the only registration grade P-Vivax study at the moment there. And I think that's going to be what sends the product in a certain direction, is that more and more that's going to be our our key product for Vivax. We actually have Tom. I'm looking around at you all. This is what I say about what's great being up here is you see who's associated with all the products at the beginning. This actually came originally from a collaboration with WHO TDR that Tom Canick was driving with people. So to say, the work that we do here is building on a lot of the work that you guys have done over the last 20 years. So that's going to the EMEA. I got in trouble earlier. It's going to the EMEA on the 5th of March. And we'll see what happens after that, but we hope to launch it at some point in 2011. I was privileged to join 2 years ago. So the first meeting that I went to was a big meeting in Seattle where Melinda French Gates stood up and she said, and remember, I have no understanding of the past history of malaria eradication, and she stood up and said, you know, as an American, as a mother, American children don't die of malaria, but other people's children do, and I don't find this acceptable. And if I paraphrase the CEO type language, it was sort of, and you guys are going to do something about it, because if you're going to spend my money for the next 50 years, then... Now, as an industry guy, I find that highly motivating and tingling, because it's an audacious task. In industry, you tend to say, well, we'll have a go at doing it, and we'll, if we die trying, we die trying, but we're going to make this happen. When we talk about what was needed to do malaria eradication, it's interesting. So the drugs I've shown you up there and the drugs in the pipeline are the things that we do in the next 20 years. This tends to be what are the drugs we need in the 20 years after that. Most of the public health people roll their eyes at that point because you're talking about drugs for 2020, 2030 when we will all be retired. But what came out was to say what we really need, and this is a working group that Pedro Alonso is leading, what we really need is we need a single encounter radical cure. So you need to be able to go to a patient, have a tablet, radical cure, one dose, kills the blood stages for falciparum, stops transmission. Like with all target product profiles, the marketing guys love it, the scientists hate it because it's virtually impossible to achieve, but that's what we're aiming at. So one dose, one cure. And he said, well, actually Vivax is a problem, so why don't you do the same for Vivax? And he said, well, it's exactly the same target product profile. It could actually be the same drug. Except, in addition, you have the hypnozoites, these dormant forms in the liver, which give you the problem with Vivax that, you know, you're going to get the disease without a mosquito bite. Third one is to say, well, in the long term, we still need these long-acting drugs which will protect people so we can have some sort of prophylaxis to stop people being affected. And drugs that would be working in expectant mothers and infants. And I'm looking around to look at somebody like Heiner, and he will roll his eyes and say, this is where we do not want to go as a pharmaceutical industry. These are the really difficult areas to go. But in a 20-year context, then this is what we have to think about, and this is where we have to think out of the box. A couple of words about artemisinin resistance, because we need to have solved artemisinin resistance by the time our drugs get there. What's interesting is that we know that there are patients with increased parasite clearance times. We know that there are parasites which are less responsive to artemisinin. We also know that our drugs work pretty well out there. I mean, the latest clinical trials still show that the drugs, the ACTs, are working. But the question is, if artemisinin starts to fail, is it just artemisinin, or is it going to bring the whole house of endoperoxide, so all these nice structures on the right-hand side, are they all going to be affected by artemisinin resistant? And I put the structures up not to boggle you with chemistry, but to say the only thing that's common across all those structures, if you look carefully, is that oxygen-oxygen bond, the endoperoxide. So as a parasite trying to work out how do you come up with a strategy to get rid of all of those, it's not so obvious. So we say what we need to know is, have we lost all those drugs, or have we lost one of them, or two of them, or three of them? Some of them we can test directly in patients. Some of them are ready to go. Others we have to test actually in parasites taken from patients because they've never been into patients before. So what we've done there is we've actually collected up everybody's endoperoxide, including some of Peter's. Everybody around the room who's got one, we have it in a collection, and we're testing those blind just to see what will happen and which drugs will be active. Thinking a bit, I blandly went over the sort of we need a single dose cure. I think I'm allowed one graph in every presentation these days. So this is my graph, and it has no labels on and no axes. So you're right. This is the second generation synthetic peroxide. So OS 439, which comes from Monash, STI, and Nebraska.